She did not cry when the pen touched the paper. She just watched. Nadia Calloway sat across the polished mahogany table in her lawyer's office, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her spine straight, her face perfectly still, and she watched her husband of 9 years sign away their marriage like he was closing a tab at a restaurant. No hesitation. No glance in her direction. Not even the courtesy of a pause. Before we dive back in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something truly special I can't wait to share. That was the moment Nadia understood. Not that the marriage was over, she had known that for months, but that she had never truly known the man sitting across from her. The man who had once pressed his forehead against hers on a rain-soaked bridge in the city of Harlow and whispered that she was the only thing in the world that made sense to him. The man who had held her hand through 2 miscarriages and told her they were enough, just the 2 of them. The man who had built an entire empire using her name, her connections, and her silence, and was now walking away from all 3 without so much as a backward glance. What Daniel Freed did not know, what he could not have known, was that the man who had been quietly watching Nadia's life fall apart from a distance of 1,200 miles was not just her estranged father. He was one of the wealthiest men alive. A man whose name appeared on no Forbes list, whose face graced no magazine cover, whose fortune existed in layers so deep and so carefully constructed that even the most seasoned financial investigators had never found the bottom of it. A man who had spent the last 8 years watching his daughter struggle, waiting for the moment she would need him, and planning, with extraordinary patience and precision, for the day she finally did. That day had come. What Daniel also did not know was that 6 months before he slid those divorce papers across the table, Nadia's father, a man named Roland Voss, had done something quietly extraordinary. He had purchased the controlling interest in Daniel's company. Not loudly. Not publicly. Through a web of holding companies and silent partnerships so intricate that Daniel's own board of directors had no idea who they were truly answering to. Roland had bought Daniel's world right out from under him. And Daniel had smiled through every meeting, every handshake, every quarterly report, completely unaware that the floor beneath his feet belonged to his father-in-law. But this story is not really about Daniel's downfall. It is not about revenge, though what comes will feel like justice. It is not even about Roland Voss and the empire he built in the shadows. This story is about Nadia. About a woman who spent 9 years making herself smaller so her husband could feel larger. A woman who gave up a career she loved, friendships she cherished, and a version of herself she is still trying to find again. A woman who sat in a lawyer's office in the city of Harlow on a gray Tuesday morning and watched her husband sign divorce papers, and felt, beneath the numbness and the grief and the quiet devastation, something she had not expected to feel. Relief. Because somewhere deep inside her, in the part of herself she had buried under 9 years of trying to be what Daniel needed, Nadia had always known. She had known about the late nights that were not really late nights. She had known about the business trips to Denton Falls that left no receipts and no itineraries. She had known about the slow, deliberate way Daniel had been moving money, their money, into accounts she could not access, structures she did not understand, a future he was building entirely without her. She had known and she had looked away, because looking meant choosing, and choosing meant loss, and loss was the thing she feared most. She is not afraid anymore. Stay with this story until the very end. Because the moment Daniel Freed walks into his own boardroom and finds his estranged father-in-law's name on the deed to his company, and his wife sitting in the chair he thought would always be his, is a moment that will take your breath away. And the lesson waiting for you at the end of this story is one that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Sometimes the people who hurt us build their confidence on one assumption, that we have no one in our corner. That we are alone. That there is no one powerful enough, or loyal enough, or patient enough to stand behind us when everything falls apart. They are not always right. This is the story of Nadia Calloway. A woman who lost everything she thought she wanted, and found, in the wreckage, everything she actually needed. A woman who did not know her father was watching. who did not know help was already on its way, who did not know that the man signing those divorce papers was not ending her story. He was beginning it. Before we tell you what happens next, we need to stop for a moment. Because this story, Nadia's story, is not just about a husband who betrayed his wife. It is not just about hidden fortunes and corporate takeovers and the kind of justice that arrives quietly and dismantles everything in its path. Those things are coming, and when they arrive, they will be extraordinary. But if you walk away from this story only remembering the dramatic moments, the boardroom, the papers, the reckoning, then we will have failed you. Because the most important thing in this story is not what happens to Daniel. It is what happens to Nadia. And more specifically, it is what happens inside Nadia. The shift that takes place in a woman who has spent nearly a decade convincing herself that staying silent was the same thing as keeping the peace. It was not. Here is what this story will teach you. We are often most loyal to the people who deserve it least. Not because we are foolish, not because we cannot see the truth, but because we have invested so much of ourselves, so much time, so much love, so much quiet sacrifice, that admitting the truth feels like admitting we wasted the best years of our lives. So we protect the lie. We explain away the distance. We fill the silences with excuses we do not fully believe. We become caretakers of a version of our marriage, our relationship, our family, that exists only in our own minds, because the alternative is grief, and grief is terrifying. Nadia did this for 9 years. And here is the painful truth that lives underneath her story, and perhaps underneath yours as well. The people who take advantage of our loyalty do not do so in one dramatic moment. They do it slowly, incrementally. A small withdrawal here, a quiet deception there, a gradual repositioning of the boundaries until one day you look around and realize that the life you are living looks almost nothing like the life you agreed to. And by then, you have been so thoroughly convinced that this is simply how things are, that this is simply who you are, that leaving feels not like freedom but like failure. This story is for every woman who has ever made herself smaller to make room for someone who was never grateful for the space. It is for every person who has confused endurance with strength, silence with grace, and staying with love. It is for everyone who has ever felt that the walls closing in around them were simply the shape of their life, not a cage they had the power to walk out of. Because here is what Nadia did not know on that gray Tuesday morning in the lawyer's office in Harlow. She did not know that the door had never been locked. She did not know that the silence she had mistaken for abandonment was actually protection. She did not know that the people who loved her most had never stopped watching, had never stopped preparing for the moment she was finally ready to fight. And she did not know that the man she had spent 9 years trying to hold together was already falling apart, had been falling apart for years, and that the only thing keeping him upright was her willingness to look away. She stopped looking away on a Tuesday. Everything changed on a Wednesday. There is a lesson in Nadia's story that goes beyond the specifics of her marriage, her father, her husband's crimes. It is a lesson about the nature of power, and specifically about who actually holds it in any given situation. We tend to assume that power belongs to the person who is loudest, the person who takes up the most space, the person who seems the most certain and the most in control. Daniel Fried was all of those things, and for 9 years, Nadia believed him. But power is not always visible. Sometimes it is patient. Sometimes it waits in the background, building quietly, accumulating evidence, making moves that will not be understood until the very last moment. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone has already underestimated. Remember that when you watch what happens next. Remember it when Nadia seems lost. Remember it when the odds seem impossible and the people around her seem too few and too small to make any difference. Remember that the story is not over until it is over, and that the ending, the real ending, the one that matters, belongs entirely to her. She just does not know it yet. Now let us go back to that Tuesday morning. Let us go back to the lawyer's office in Harlow, to the mahogany table and the unsigned papers and the pen moving across the page. Let us go back to Nadia's folded hands and her straight spine and her perfectly still face. Let us begin. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and expensive cologne. It was the kind of room designed to make people feel small. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, leather chairs that were just uncomfortable enough to remind you this was not a place for lingering. A single window overlooked the gray skyline of Harlow, the morning fog still clinging to the buildings like it could not quite bring itself to let go. Nadia had arrived 12 minutes early. She had not slept the night before. She had lain in the bedroom of the house she and Daniel had shared for 7 years, the house she had chosen, had decorated, had filled with small, carefully selected things that were supposed to mean something, and she had stared at the ceiling until the darkness thinned into pale gray morning light. Then she had gotten up, made coffee she did not drink, dressed in the navy blazer she wore when she needed to feel like herself, and driven to the office of a man named Gerald Patton, family law attorney, in complete silence. No music. No radio. Just the sound of the city waking up around her and the dull, persistent ache of someone who already knows how the day is going to end. Daniel arrived 4 minutes late. He did not apologize for this. He walked in with the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life considered that his lateness might inconvenience anyone else. He wore a charcoal suit she had never seen before, a new tie, shoes that had clearly just been polished. He looked, she thought, like a man who was celebrating something. He glanced at her once across the room, a brief, assessing look, the kind you give a piece of furniture you are deciding whether to keep, and then he pulled out the chair across the table and sat down without a word. Gerald Patton cleared his throat and began explaining the documents spread across the table. Division of assets, property evaluation, financial disclosures. He used the careful, measured language of a man paid to make devastating things sound procedural. Nadia listened. She understood perhaps half of what he said. The other half dissolved somewhere between her ears and her brain, lost in the strange roaring silence that had taken up residence inside her chest somewhere around the time Daniel walked through the door and did not look at her like she was a person he had once loved. She had prepared herself for this moment. She had told herself in the weeks leading up to it that she was ready, that she had processed enough, grieved enough, accepted enough, that she could sit across a table from her husband of 9 years and watch the legal dissolution of their marriage with something approaching composure. She had believed this because she needed to believe it. She had been wrong. Because what no amount of preparation could have readied her for was the specific quality of Daniel's indifference. Not anger. Not guilt. Not even the cold satisfaction of a man who had won something. Just nothing. He reviewed the documents with the brisk efficiency of someone clearing their inbox. He asked 2 questions, both of them financial, neither of them about her. He uncapped his pen, a heavy silver pen she had given him for their 5th anniversary, engraved with both their initials, and she wondered if he had even remembered that when he reached for it that morning, and he signed his name at the bottom of the first document without pausing. Then the second. Then the third. Nadia watched his hand move across each page. She watched the ink dry. She watched Gerald Patton collect the documents with practiced efficiency and slide them into a folder that would become, in some government office somewhere, the official record of the end of her marriage. 9 years. 3 documents. 12 minutes. It was the pen she kept coming back to. That silver pen with their initials intertwined on the barrel. She had spent 3 weeks choosing it. She remembered standing in the jewelry shop on Alderton Street, turning it over in her hands, imagining his face when he opened the box. She had thought, in that shop on that afternoon 5 years ago, that she was building something permanent. That the engraving was a kind of declaration, these 2 sets of initials belonging together, always, the way she believed they always would. He had not even noticed. Or perhaps he had noticed and simply did not care, which was somehow worse. Gerald Patton was speaking again, something about processing timelines and court filings and 30-day waiting periods, but Nadia was no longer fully in the room. She was somewhere else, somewhere between the woman who had stood in that jewelry shop 5 years ago full of quiet certainty, and the woman sitting in this leather chair watching her marriage end, trying to understand how the distance between those two moments had been crossed without her ever seeing it happen. When had it started? That was the question she could not stop turning over. Not when had she noticed. She could pinpoint that with uncomfortable precision. A Thursday evening 14 months ago, a phone left unlocked on the kitchen counter, a message from a name she did not recognize that made the floor drop out from under her. But when had it actually started? When had Daniel made the first small decision to become someone other than the man she married? She had spent 14 months trying to answer that question. She had tried counseling, alone, because Daniel refused to attend more than 2 sessions, citing his schedule, his workload, his perpetual and apparently inexhaustible list of more important things. She had tried patience. She had tried distance. She had tried the kind of careful, deliberate vulnerability that left her feeling exposed and foolish when he responded to it with distraction or silence. She had tried being smaller, quieter, less demanding, less present, as though the problem was the amount of space she took up rather than the ever-widening absence where her husband used to be. Nothing worked. Nothing changed. And 14 months after that Thursday evening in the kitchen, here she was. The meeting ended. Gerald Patton shook both their hands with professional neutrality. Daniel was already checking his phone before they reached the corridor. He had a meeting at 11, he said, almost to himself. He would be in touch through the lawyers regarding the house valuation. He hoped this could all be handled efficiently. He walked to the elevator without looking back. Nadia stood in the corridor of Gerald Patton's office building and watched the elevator doors close behind her husband and felt the full weight of it settle onto her shoulders. Not the anger, that would come later, sharp and clarifying and necessary. Not the grief, that had been living in her for over a year already, a low persistent ache she had grown almost accustomed to. What she felt standing in that corridor was something quieter and in some ways more devastating than either of those things. She felt invisible, like she had spent 9 years pouring herself into a life that had been slowly, quietly, deliberately dismantled around her, and no one had thought to tell her. Like she had been the last to know the story she was living in had already ended. She took the stairs down. She needed the time. Outside, Harlow was going about its morning with complete indifference to the fact that her world had just been reorganized into before and after. Buses ran their routes. Coffee shops filled with people who had places to be. The fog was lifting finally, burning off in patches, the pale winter sun beginning to push through. Nadia sat down on a bench across from the building and did something she had not done in 14 months of holding everything together. She let herself fall apart. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, on a bench in Harlow, in her navy blazer, with her hands pressed flat against her thighs. She cried. Long and silently and completely, until there was nothing left, until the bench was just a bench again, and the city was just a city, and she was just a woman sitting in the winter sun trying to remember what came next. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it. It buzzed again. Then again. Then a 4th time. She pulled it out. 4 missed calls. All from the same number. A number she did not recognize, with a country code she could not immediately place. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she put the phone back in her pocket, stood up, straightened her blazer, and began to walk. She did not know yet that those 4 missed calls would change everything. She did not know that the number belonged to a man she had not spoken to in 11 years. She did not know that while she had been sitting in that lawyer's office watching her husband sign away their marriage, her father had already begun dismantling his. She just walked, 1 foot in front of the other, through the lifting fog and the pale winter sun and the indifferent morning streets of Harlow. Not knowing. Not yet. Priya Anand arrived at Nadia's front door at 7:30 the following morning carrying 2 takeaway coffees and the particular expression of someone who had been awake for most of the night on someone else's behalf. Nadia had called her at 11 the previous evening. Not with a plan, not with a coherent account of everything that had happened, just with a specific, wordless distress signal that existed between people who had known each other long enough to have developed their own private language of need. She had said Priya's name and stopped, and Priya had said, "I will be there in the morning," and had not asked any of the questions that could wait until morning. That was the thing about Priya. She had an instinctive understanding of which questions could wait. Nadia opened the door and Priya looked at her, really looked, the way she always did, with the focused attention of someone who had learned over 20 years of friendship that the most important information was usually the stuff Nadia was not saying, and she handed over the coffee and walked inside without waiting to be invited because she had not needed to be invited to this house since the year they both turned 24. "You look terrible," Priya said, in the tone of voice that made this a statement of care rather than criticism. "Thank you," Nadia said. They sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Nadia had been sitting when she found the unlocked phone 14 months ago, a detail she was aware of with the low persistent awareness of someone who had never quite been able to make a room feel neutral again after something happened in it. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and she told Priya everything. Gerald Patton's office, the mahogany table, the 3 documents and the 12 minutes and the silver pen. Daniel's new suit and his polished shoes and the way he had glanced at her like furniture being assessed. The pale rectangle on the shelf where their photograph used to be. The bench in Harlow. The 4 missed calls from the unrecognized number. Priya listened without interrupting. This was one of her extraordinary qualities, the ability to absorb difficult information without reflexively filling every pause with response, to let things land completely before she spoke. When Nadia finished, Priya was quiet for a moment, her own coffee untouched, her eyes steady and serious across the table. Then she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as someone who loves you and not as someone delivering a verdict." Nadia looked at her. "Tell me." "I have been worried about you for 2 years," Priya said. "Not in a general way. In a specific way. The way you started apologizing for things that were not your fault. The way you stopped talking about your own work, your own ideas, like they had become somehow less important than whatever Daniel needed that week. The way you flinched sometimes in conversations when his name came up, even in perfectly ordinary contexts, like you were permanently braced for something." She paused. "I noticed all of it, and I said nothing because every time I came close to saying something you redirected the conversation, and I told myself you were handling it in your own way and that it was not my place to push." She met Nadia's eyes directly. "I should have pushed," she said. "I am sorry I did not push." Nadia felt the truth of this settle through her, without the sting she might once have felt at it. There was no accusation in Priya's words, only the honest accounting of a friend who had made a choice she now wished she had made differently, delivered without self-protection or deflection. "You tried once," Nadia said. "About 18 months ago. At Rosaria's birthday dinner." Priya nodded. "You told me I was reading too much into things and changed the subject to the food." "The food was genuinely very good," Nadia said. Something shifted between them. The particular shift that sometimes happens when people are talking about something painful and find unexpectedly that it contains a small pocket of lightness, not enough to diminish the weight of it but enough to make it briefly bearable. Priya smiled. Then her expression settled back into seriousness. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Nadia told her about the missed calls. About the country code she had not immediately recognized. About the 4 attempts across a single afternoon from a number that had no name attached to it, and that she had been too exhausted and too submerged in the aftermath of Gerald Patton's office to return. Priya picked up her coffee. "Have you called it back?" she asked. "Not yet." "Why not?" Nadia considered the question. "Because I have had enough information for one day," she said finally. "Because yesterday I found out my marriage is officially over and my husband does not consider me worth looking at across a table, and whatever that phone call contains I am not sure I have the capacity to absorb it on top of everything else." Priya looked at her steadily. "What if it is important?" "Everything is important," Nadia said. "That is the problem. Everything is too important and there is too much of it, and I am sitting in this kitchen and I cannot quite remember what my life looked like before it all started coming apart. Priya reached across the table and put her hand over Nadia's. Her grip was warm and firm and entirely uncomplicated, the grip of someone who was not going anywhere and needed Nadia to know that. Here is what we are going to do, Priya said. You are going to call the number. I am going to sit right here while you do it. And whatever it is, whatever it means, we are going to figure out the next step together. Not all the steps, just the next one. Nadia looked at her best friend across the kitchen table. At the woman who had shown up at 7:30 in the morning with 2 coffees and 20 years of accumulated loyalty. At the woman who had watched and worried and waited and was now sitting in the direct light of everything she had been worried about, steady and present and completely unafraid. Just the next one, she repeated. Priya nodded. That is all you ever need. Nadia picked up her phone. She found the number, still there, still unnamed, the 4 missed calls listed in a neat column beneath the single word unknown. She pressed call before she could think about it long enough to find a reason not to. It rang twice. A man answered. His voice was measured and professional, carrying the particular cadence of someone accustomed to delivering significant information in a way designed to prevent the recipient from panicking before they had heard all of it. Mrs. Freed, he said. Thank you for returning my call. My name is Lawrence Obi. I am a solicitor. I represent a client who has asked me to make contact with you as a matter of some urgency. I want to assure you before I say anything further that this call is entirely in your interest and that what I have to tell you is— He paused, selecting his word with evident care, consequential. Nadia looked at Priya across the table. Priya watched her with the focused, alert attention of someone reading a situation from one side of a conversation. Who is your client? Nadia asked. Lawrence Obi was quiet for a moment. His name is Theodore Voss, he said. I believe you know him as your father. The kitchen was very still. The coffee had gone cold. Outside the window, the morning was getting on with itself with complete indifference, the way mornings did. I have not spoken to my father in 11 years, Nadia said carefully. I do not have a relationship with my father. I do not know why he would be contacting me through a solicitor, and I am not sure I want to know. I understand, Lawrence said. And I want to be clear that my client is not asking for a relationship, or for forgiveness, or for anything beyond the opportunity to share some information with you that he believes you urgently need. Information relating to your husband, and to certain financial arrangements that have been made on your behalf without your knowledge. The last 3 words landed with a precision that cut through the numbness she had been wrapped in since the previous morning. Without my knowledge, she repeated. Without your knowledge, Lawrence confirmed. Mrs. Freed, I would very much like to meet with you in person. At your convenience, at a location entirely of your choosing. What I have to tell you is not something I am able to do adequate justice to over the phone. Nadia looked at Priya. Priya was watching her with an expression that had shifted from alert to something more electric, the expression of someone who has just registered that the conversation they are witnessing has moved into entirely unexpected territory. Give me a moment, Nadia said to Lawrence. She lowered the phone. She looked at Priya. He says he is a solicitor, Nadia said. Representing my father. He says my father has information about Daniel. About financial arrangements made in my name without my knowledge. Priya stared at her. Your father, she said. The father you have not spoken to in 11 years. That one, yes. Priya looked at the phone in Nadia's hand. She looked at Nadia's face. Then she said the thing that Nadia most needed someone to say. Not advice, not caution, not a measured assessment of risks and considerations, but simply and directly the thing that was true. You have to meet him, she said. Nadia looked at her best friend for a long moment. Then she raised the phone back to her ear. Mr. Obi, she said. When can we meet? They met Lawrence Obi that afternoon at a quiet hotel on the north side of Harlow, Nadia's choice of venue, as he had offered. Priya came with her. Nadia had not asked her to, and Priya had not offered. She had simply picked up her coat when Nadia picked up hers, and that had been that. Lawrence Obi was a man in his late 50s with a composed, unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades in rooms where significant things were decided and had developed an immunity to being rushed. He stood when they entered, shook both their hands, waited until they were seated before he sat down himself, and opened the meeting not with documents or disclosures but with a question. He asked Nadia what she knew about her father's professional life. Not very much, she told him honestly. She knew he had money. Her mother had told her that much, in the understated way her mother had of acknowledging things she found uncomfortable. She knew he had business interests she had never fully understood. She knew he had been absent for most of her childhood and present in ways that felt more obligatory than genuine for the years before the estrangement. She knew that when she cut him out of her life 11 years ago, she had done so with the conviction of someone who had enough evidence to make a permanent decision and had never looked back. Lawrence listened to all of this with the same careful attention he had given her silence on the phone. Then he opened the folder on the table between them. What I am about to tell you, he said, will require some time to absorb. I ask only that you hear all of it before you respond to any of it. Can you do that? Nadia looked at the folder, at the documents visible beneath the cover page, at the name at the top of the first sheet, Voss Meridian Holdings, which meant nothing to her yet. She looked at Priya, who gave her the smallest nod. She looked back at Lawrence. Yes, she said. Tell me everything. The drive to Westfield Manor took 40 minutes from the center of Harlow. Nadia had never been to this part of the county before. The roads narrowed as they left the city, winding through stretches of dense woodland that opened occasionally onto sweeping views of the valley below. It was the kind of landscape that felt deliberately removed from the world, as though whoever had chosen to build out here had wanted to make the point that distance was a form of power. Priya had offered to drive. Nadia had let her, mostly because her own hands had not quite stopped shaking since the coffee shop. She sat in the passenger seat watching the trees blur past the window and turning the conversation with Lawrence Obi over in her mind, pulling it apart and examining each piece separately the way you might handle something fragile and unfamiliar. Her father had been watching her. For 8 years, her father had been watching her. The idea was almost impossible to hold. Nadia had spent 11 years constructing a version of her father that made his absence bearable, a version in which he was simply gone, simply absent, simply a man who had chosen his silence and his distance and his separate life over any relationship with the daughter he had left behind. That version was easier than the alternative, which was wondering whether he had ever thought about her at all. She had chosen not to wonder. She had buried the question under years of deliberate not thinking and built her life on top of it. Now Lawrence Obi was telling her the question had always had an answer. The gates of Westfield Manor appeared around a bend in the road, tall iron gates set into a stone wall that stretched in both directions as far as Nadia could see. A security panel glowed softly at the entrance. Priya slowed to a stop. Before either of them could speak, the gates swung open. Someone had been expecting them. The driveway was long and lined with oak trees so old and so tall they formed a canopy overhead, the branches interlocking above the car like the arched ceiling of a cathedral. The house appeared at the end of it gradually, first a roofline, then chimneys, then the full face of an enormous stone building that seemed to have grown out of the landscape rather than been built upon it. It was not showy in the way Nadia might have expected wealth to be showy. It was simply settled, sure of itself. The kind of house that had nothing to prove. A man was standing at the front door. Nadia recognized him before the car had fully stopped, and the recognition hit her somewhere behind the sternum with a force she had not prepared for. He was older than she remembered. Of course he was. 11 years was 11 years. Thinner, his hair fully silver now, his face carrying the particular kind of stillness that sometimes came with age and sometimes came with illness. He wore a dark wool sweater and dark trousers, and he stood very straight, his hands at his sides, watching the car come to a stop with an expression Nadia could not immediately read. Her father, Theodore Voss. She sat in the car for a moment after Priya turned off the engine. Just sat there. Priya said nothing, which was exactly right, exactly what Nadia needed. Just silence and the sound of the wind in the oak trees, and the time to decide whether her legs would carry her out of the car and up the stone steps toward the man she had not spoken to since she was 26 years old. They did. Theodore did not move toward her. He waited, which she understood instinctively was the right thing, that rushing toward her would have felt like pressure, and she had had enough pressure to last a lifetime. He waited until she was standing 2 feet in front of him, and then he said her name, just once, quietly, the way you say the name of something you have been afraid to lose. Nadia. She did not hug him. They were not there yet. But she held his gaze, and he held hers, and something passed between them in that moment. Not forgiveness, not yet, that was a country with a long road leading to it, but something that might have been the first step toward the border. Come inside, he said. There is a great deal I need to tell you. The study at Westfield Manor was a room that had clearly been lived in and thought in for many years. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves covered 3 of the 4 walls, the books arranged with a slightly imperfect order of someone who actually read them rather than arranged them for appearance. A fire burned in the grate. 2 armchairs faced each other across a low table on which sat a teapot, 2 cups, and a folder so thick it might have been a novel. Priya had been shown to a sitting room by a quietly efficient woman named Mrs. Adler, who appeared to run the house with the calm authority of someone who had been doing so for decades. Nadia sat in one of the armchairs. Theodore sat in the other. For a moment neither of them spoke. I know you have questions, Theodore said at last. I know 11 years of silence earns me a great deal of anger and very little trust. I am not going to ask you to set that aside. I am going to ask you to listen, and then you can decide what to do with what I tell you. Nadia nodded once. She folded her hands in her lap, the same posture she had held in Gerald Patton's office that morning, though this time it felt less like composure and more like self-protection. Speak then, she said. Theodore reached forward and opened the folder on the table. The first document was a corporate registration certificate. The company name at the top of the page was Voss Meridian Holdings. The registration date was 14 months ago. The same month, Nadia realized with a jolt, as the Thursday evening in the kitchen with Daniel's unlocked phone. 6 weeks after I learned what your husband was doing, Theodore said, I began acquiring shares in Freed Capital Group. Slowly. Through intermediaries. Through a structure designed to be invisible to anyone looking from the outside. By the time your husband filed for divorce, I held controlling interest. Nadia stared at the document. The numbers on the page were not numbers she had any frame of reference for. She had known, in the vague way that children know things about their parents without fully understanding them, that her father had money. Her mother had told her that much before the estrangement, in the careful, understated way her mother talked about things she found uncomfortable. He is a wealthy man, her mother had said once. More than people know. Nadia had filed this information away without examining it. She examined it now. How much, she asked, not because the number would change anything, but because she needed to understand the scale of what she was being told. Theodore was quiet for a moment. Then he named a figure. Nadia looked at him. She looked back at the document. She looked at him again. He met her eyes without flinching. He had clearly been prepared for this reaction, or rather, for the absence of any adequate reaction, because there was no adequate reaction to what he had just told her. The number he had named was not the kind of number that belonged in the same conversation as Gerald Patton's mahogany table and Daniel's silver pen and 30-day court processing timelines. It was the kind of number that existed in a different category of reality entirely. Your husband has been embezzling from his own company, Theodore continued, his voice steady and careful, paced like a man who had rehearsed this conversation many times. For approximately 3 years. The amounts began small and grew considerably larger as his confidence increased. He has been moving the money through a series of subsidiary accounts, some of them registered in your name, without your knowledge or authorization. Nadia felt the blood leave her face. In your name, she repeated. Theodore nodded. He was building a contingency. If the embezzlement was discovered before he could complete his exit, the paper trail would lead to you first. The accounts are structured so that your signature appears on the originating documents we believe were forged, but which would require forensic analysis to prove. He was not simply leaving you, Theodore said quietly. He was positioning you to take the fall for crimes he committed. The fire crackled in the grate. Outside the windows, the oak trees moved in the wind. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked with the unhurried patience of something that had been keeping time in this room for longer than Nadia had been alive. She thought about the 9 years. The counseling sessions Daniel refused to attend. The business trips with no receipts. The way he had looked at her across Gerald Patton's table that morning, that brief, assessing glance, furniture being evaluated. She thought about the silver pen with their initials on the barrel. He had been planning this the entire time. Not just the affair. Not just the divorce. All of it, the accounts in her name, the forged signatures, the exit strategy, all of it had been constructed with the same quiet, deliberate precision that Daniel brought to everything he considered worth his full attention. He had simply never considered her worth his. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Why now? Why not a year ago, 2 years ago, before any of this happened?" Theodore was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the fire rather than at her, and in the quality of that pause Nadia understood that whatever came next was going to cost him something. "Because a year ago," he said finally, "you were still trying to save the marriage. And 2 years ago you did not yet know there was anything to save it from. I watched you, Nadia. I watched you try. I watched you bend yourself into shapes no person should have to bend into, trying to hold something together that he had already decided to destroy. And I made myself wait. Because if I had come to you before you were ready, before you had exhausted every other option and arrived at the truth yourself, you would not have believed me." She hated that he was right. She hated it with a fierce, specific anger that had nowhere clean to land. Because he was right, she knew he was right. She knew that 12 months ago she would have heard everything he was telling her now and found a way to explain it away, to protect the version of her marriage she needed to believe in. She would have chosen Daniel over the truth because she was not yet ready to choose herself. She was ready now. "What do you want to do?" Theodore asked. He closed the folder. He lifted his eyes from the fire and looked at her directly, and there was something in his expression she had not seen in 11 years, something careful and uncertain and almost afraid. He was asking, not telling, not instructing, asking. She looked at her father across the low table with its teapot and its documents and its revelation that had reorganized the architecture of everything she thought she understood about her life. She looked at the man who had been watching from 1,200 miles away, building a fortress around her without her knowledge, waiting for the moment she needed it. She thought about Daniel in his charcoal suit, his new tie, his polished shoes, his silver pen. She thought about Gerald Patton's folder and its 3 documents and its 12 minutes. She thought about the woman who had sat on a bench in Harlow that morning and cried until there was nothing left. And then she thought about what came after the crying. The moment she had stood up and straightened her blazer and begun to walk. That specific moment, not dramatic, not triumphant, just a woman deciding to put one foot in front of the other. She wanted more of that feeling. She wanted to walk forward. She wanted to stop bending herself into shapes that left her unrecognizable. She looked at her father and said 3 words that surprised them both with their steadiness and their clarity and their complete absence of hesitation. "I want justice." Theodore Voss looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression. the uncertainty giving way to something older and quieter and immeasurably more resolute. "Good," he said. "Then let us begin." Lawrence Obie arrived at Westfield Manor the following morning at 8 o'clock sharp, carrying a leather briefcase that Nadia was beginning to understand was something of a trademark. He was accompanied this time by two people she had not met before, a woman named Claire Sutton, introduced as a forensic accountant, and a younger man named Patrick Reeves who specialized, Lawrence explained with a measured understatement of someone describing a perfectly ordinary profession, in digital evidence recovery and financial fraud investigation. Priya had stayed the night. Nadia had not asked her to. She had simply appeared at the door of the guest room at 11 the previous evening with 2 mugs of tea and the quiet, uncomplicated presence of someone who understood that some nights were not meant to be spent alone. They had not talked much. They did not need to. Priya sat in the armchair by the window while Nadia lay on top of the covers still fully dressed, staring at the ceiling, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that had been built over years of knowing each other well enough not to fill every space with words. In the morning Nadia showered, borrowed a clean shirt from Mrs. Adler, who produced one with the same calm efficiency with which she appeared to produce everything, and came downstairs to find her father already in the study with Lawrence and the 2 new arrivals, for cups of coffee on the table, the thick folder from the previous evening joined now by several more. Theodore looked up when she entered. He did not say good morning. He said, "Are you ready?" and she appreciated the directness of it, the absence of preamble, the acknowledgement that they were past the stage of pleasantries. She sat down. She picked up a coffee. She said yes. Claire Sutton spoke first. She had the brisk, precise manner of someone who spent her professional life translating complicated financial structures into language that made wrongdoing impossible to misunderstand, and she did this now with a clarity that Nadia found simultaneously impressive and nauseating. Daniel's embezzlement had begun, Claire explained, approximately 38 months ago. It had started with small diversions, amounts modest enough to disappear into the ordinary noise of a company-freed capital group size without attracting immediate attention. Expense report manipulations. Vendor invoices paid to shell companies Daniel controlled. A consulting retainer paid monthly to a firm that existed only on paper. Over time the amounts had grown. Over time the structure had become more sophisticated. Over time Daniel had apparently concluded, correctly, for longer than he deserved, that no one was looking closely enough to notice. The offshore accounts, Claire said, pulling a document from the folder and sliding it across the table toward Nadia, are registered across 3 jurisdictions: the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, and a smaller holding registered in the name of a company called Alderton Meridian Group. Nadia looked up sharply at the name. "Alderton," she said. "As in Alderton Street." Claire paused. "Yes, we believe the name was chosen deliberately. A private reference. Something only someone who knew you well would understand." Nadia thought about the jewelry shop on Alderton Street where she had stood 5 years ago turning a silver pen over in her hands. She thought about the initials she had chosen to have engraved on the barrel. She felt something cold and quiet move through her that was not quite anger and not quite grief but existed in the specific territory between the two. He had named his hidden account after the street where she had bought him an anniversary gift. She did not say anything. She looked back at the document and kept her face very still. "The account registered under your name," Claire continued, "is the most important piece. It is the one Daniel intended to be found first in the event of an investigation. The signature on the originating documents is a forgery. Our handwriting analysis is already 94% confident of this, but it is a sophisticated forgery. Convincing enough to create serious problems without the kind of forensic support your father has been able to assemble." "How serious?" Nadia asked. Claire met her eyes. "Without the counter-evidence we have built, serious enough that you would likely have faced criminal charges before Daniel did. That was the design." Patrick Reeves took over then, opening a laptop and turning it to face Nadia across the table. He had recovered, he explained, a series of internal communications from Daniel's work devices, emails, encrypted messages, calendar entries, that documented not just the financial crimes but the planning behind them. There were messages to Daniel's personal lawyer, a man named Stuart Greer, that dated back 22 months, predating the divorce filing by nearly 2 years, discussing the account structure, the forged documentation, and, in one exchange that made Nadia's hands tighten around her coffee cup, the specific strategy of using her name as the primary point of exposure. She is trusting Patrick read aloud from the email, his voice careful and neutral. She will not look too closely at the financial structure because she never has. By the time anyone starts asking questions, I will be 3 steps removed and her name will be on everything that matters. The room was very quiet after that. Nadia set down her coffee cup. She looked at the laptop screen, at the words in Daniel's font and Daniel's phrasing and Daniel's unmistakable habit of writing in short declarative sentences that left no room for ambiguity. She had always found that quality in him compelling once. The certainty of him. The way he moved through decisions without the second-guessing that plagued her own thinking. She understood now that what she had mistaken for confidence was simply the absence of conscience. Theodore had been quiet through most of the morning's presentation, listening with the focused stillness of a man who had already heard all of this and was watching his daughter hear it for the first time, measuring her reactions with the careful attention of someone who was not sure how much weight she could carry at once. After Patrick finished, Theodore spoke. "There is one more element," he said. He looked at Nadia directly. "This one is harder." She held his gaze. "Tell me." Daniel has a partner. Not a business partner. Someone who has been actively assisting him in the construction of the account structure. Someone inside Freed Capital Group who has access to the systems required to move the money without triggering internal alerts. Who? Nadia asked. Theodore nodded to Lawrence, who produced a photograph from the folder and placed it on the table face down. Lawrence looked at Nadia before turning it over, giving her the fraction of a second to prepare herself. She did not need to see the photograph to know. Something in the quality of the pause, in the particular care with which Lawrence had placed it on the table, told her before he turned it over. The photograph showed Daniel at a restaurant she recognized, Carrington House on the east side of Harlow, the place he had taken her on their first anniversary, a detail that landed with the dull specific pain of something deliberately chosen. He was sitting across from a woman. Dark hair, late 30s, a burgundy jacket Nadia had seen before without registering where. They were not being romantic. There was nothing obviously intimate about the image. They were leaning toward each other over what appeared to be a laptop, their expressions focused and purposeful. The woman's name was Sable Renner. She was the head of internal compliance at Freed Capital Group, the person whose job it was, Nadia understood with a slow, clarifying horror, to prevent exactly the kind of financial misconduct she had been actively enabling. She had been with the company for 4 years. Daniel had hired her personally. She is not just an accomplice, Lawrence said quietly. She is the architect of the internal structure. Without her access and her cooperation, the accounts could never have been hidden inside the company's systems the way they were. She built the walls around it. Nadia looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she looked up at Lawrence. "Does she know about me?" she asked. "About the accounts in my name." Lawrence did not answer immediately, which was itself an answer. "She designed that part of it," Lawrence said finally. "It was her suggestion." They worked through the afternoon and into the evening. Nadia sat at the study table with Claire and Patrick and Lawrence, going through documents, asking questions, building her understanding of the structure piece by piece. Theodore moved in and out of the room, bringing food that Nadia mostly forgot to eat, occasionally sitting quietly at the edge of the conversation when the weight of it became something that needed witnessing rather than just processing. By 6 o'clock Nadia had a clear picture of what had been built against her and what had been built in her defense. The evidence assembled by Theodore's investigators was extensive: bank records, digital communications, forensic analysis, testimony from 2 former Freed Capital employees who had noticed irregularities and been pressured into silence. Lawrence had already been in contact with the relevant regulatory authorities. The groundwork for a formal investigation had been quietly laid over the preceding months, waiting only for Nadia's decision to move forward. There was one piece still missing. "We need someone on the inside," Claire said. "Someone currently at Freed Capital who can confirm the operational details of the account structure. Someone whose testimony connects the documentary evidence to the day-to-day reality of how this was run." Nadia thought about this. She thought about the people she had known through Daniel's professional life, the dinners, the company events, the colleagues whose names she had learned and whose faces she could picture but whose lives she had never truly entered. Then she thought about someone specific. A woman she had met twice at company functions, both times briefly, both times with a distinct impression of someone who was carrying something heavy and trying not to let it show. A woman who had looked at Nadia across a crowded room at last year's company Christmas event with an expression that Nadia had filed away at the time as vague discomfort and now, with a particular clarity of hindsight, reread as something much closer to guilt. Her name was Tamsin Ord. She was a senior analyst at Freed Capital Group. And she had left the company abruptly, without explanation, 6 weeks ago. Nadia looked at Lawrence. "I think I know who you need," she said. "But I need to be the one to approach her. Not a lawyer. Not an investigator. Me." Lawrence looked at Theodore. Theodore looked at his daughter. Whatever he saw in her face appeared to satisfy him. He nodded. "Then we find Tamsin Ord," Theodore said. "And we hear what she has to say." Tamsin Ord lived in a ground-floor flat on the eastern edge of Harlow, in a quiet residential street of terraced houses that had the slightly subdued quality of a neighborhood still deciding what it wanted to be. The front gardens were small and mostly tidy. The street was narrow enough that 2 cars passing each other required a degree of negotiation. It was, Nadia thought as Priya pulled up outside, the kind of place you moved to when you needed to disappear from something without going so far that you felt you had run away. She understood that impulse completely. It took a lot of care and time to prepare and narrate this for you, so if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe really helps and means the world to us. All right, let's get back to it. She had asked Priya to come with her, partly because Priya had a gift for making people feel safe in ways Nadia could not always manufacture on her own, and partly because she was not entirely sure what she was walking into. Lawrence had tracked down Tamsin's address through channels he did not fully explain and had confirmed only that Tamsin had not left Harlow after her abrupt departure from Freed Capital, that she was here, in this flat, living quietly and apparently not working, which Lawrence said with the careful neutrality of someone noting a detail he found significant without wanting to editorialize. Nadia had called ahead. She had not explained why she was calling, only that she was Daniel Freed's wife, that she needed to speak with Tamsin, and that what she had to say was not what Tamsin might be expecting. There had been a long silence on the other end of the line before Tamsin agreed to meet her. The door opened before Nadia could knock. Tamsin Ord was smaller than Nadia remembered from the Christmas function, or perhaps she had simply seemed smaller now, standing in the doorway of her own flat in jeans and a gray sweater, without the professional armor of a work event to fill out the space around her. She was in her mid-30s, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of weeks of poor sleep, and she looked at Nadia with an expression of such complicated apprehension that Nadia felt the last trace of whatever adversarial energy she had carried to the door dissolve almost immediately. This was not a villain. This was someone who was afraid. "Come in," Tamsin said. Her voice was quiet and careful. "I have been expecting someone to come eventually. I did not expect it to be you." The flat was neat in the way that spaces become neat when their occupant has too much time and too much anxiety, everything in its precise place, nothing left to chance, the particular order of someone managing the things they could control because everything else felt unmanageable. A kettle boiled in the kitchen. 2 cups were already on the counter. Tamsin had been expecting this conversation long enough to prepare for it. They sat at the small kitchen table. Priya stayed near the door, quiet and unobtrusive, a steady presence at the edge of the room. Tamsin wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at Nadia with the wary attention of someone who had rehearsed several versions of this encounter and was not yet sure which one was actually happening. "I am not here to threaten you," Nadia said. I need you to understand that before anything else. I am not here on behalf of Daniel. I am not here on behalf of his lawyers. I am here because I have spent 9 years married to a man I did not fully know, and I am trying to understand what actually happened. And I think you can help me with that. Tamsin was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How much do you know?" Nadia told her. Not everything, not the full extent of Theodore's involvement, not the regulatory groundwork already laid, not the forensic analysis of the forged signatures. But enough. Enough for Tamsin to understand that Nadia was not arriving empty-handed, that this was not a fishing expedition, that the walls around Daniel's carefully constructed deception were already beginning to come down. As she spoke, she watched something shift in Tamsin's face. The wariness did not disappear entirely, but it changed quality, becoming less the wariness of someone guarding a secret and more the wariness of someone deciding how much of a burden they are willing to set down at once. When Nadia finished, Tamsin looked at her mug for a long moment. Then she looked up. "I did not know it was your name on the accounts," she said. "Not at first. When I found out, I told Daniel it was wrong, that it crossed a line. He told me it was already done, and that if I said anything about it, I would be the one who had to explain why I had spent 4 years facilitating the rest of it without raising concerns." Nadia held very still. "4 years," she said. Tamsin nodded. She looked like someone who had been holding a confession inside for so long it had calcified. "I was not complicit from the beginning. I want you to understand that. When I took the compliance role, I genuinely did not know what the internal account structure concealed. It took me 18 months to understand what I was looking at, and by that time Daniel had made it very clear what would happen if I tried to report it." "What did he threaten you with?" Nadia asked. Tamsin set down her mug. She folded her hands on the table in an unconscious mirror of the posture Nadia had used in Gerald Patton's office, and the parallel landed quietly, like a small recognition between two people who had been shaped by the same pressure without knowing it. "He had documentation," she said. "Fabricated, I believe, but convincing. Records suggesting that several of the early account transfers had been authorized by me. He said if I went to anyone, regulators, police, the board, he would release them and I would be charged as the primary architect of the entire scheme. He said his lawyers would ensure I never worked in finance again. He said he had enough to destroy me professionally and personally, and that if I doubted him I was welcome to test it." She paused. Her jaw tightened briefly, then released. "I did not test it," she said quietly. "I was afraid. I had a mother with significant medical bills, a mortgage, a career I had spent 15 years building. I was afraid, and I made the choice that afraid people make. I stayed quiet and I stayed in the role, and I told myself I would find another way out." "Did you find one?" Nadia asked. 6 weeks ago, Tamsin said, "I decided that there was no version of staying quiet that did not eventually destroy me anyway. So I resigned. I have been sitting in this flat ever since, trying to work out what to do next." She looked at Nadia directly. "And then you called." They talked for 2 hours. The kettle boiled twice more. Priya moved from the door to a chair at some point without anyone quite noticing the transition. Outside, the narrow street went about its afternoon with the indifferent steadiness of streets everywhere. Tamsin had kept records. This was the detail that mattered most, the detail that Nadia had hoped for but not been certain of, the thread that Lawrence and Claire had identified as the missing connection between documentary evidence and operational reality. Over 4 years of quiet, frightened, methodical self-preservation, Tamsin had copied and retained documentation of the account structures she had been ordered to maintain. Internal memos, system access logs, communications from Daniel and from Sable Renner that outlined, in the kind of explicit operational detail that investigators dreamed of, the precise mechanics of how the embezzlement had been concealed. She had put it all on an encrypted drive that she kept in a fireproof box under her bed because she had not known what else to do with it, and she had been too afraid to do anything with it, and she had told herself every month for 4 years that next month she would figure out a plan. She had not figured out a plan. But Nadia had one. It was on the drive back to Westfield Manor that it happened. They had been on the road for perhaps 20 minutes, the city giving way to the narrowing roads and the stretches of woodland, the afternoon light going golden through the trees, and Nadia had been sitting quietly processing the conversation with Tamsin when her phone rang. Not Lawrence. Not Theodore. A number she did not recognize. She answered it. The voice on the other end was a woman's, older, slightly breathless, with an accent Nadia placed after a moment as somewhere in the north of the country. She introduced herself as Dr. Fenella Marsh, and she said she was calling from the Whitbourne Medical Center, and she said she was calling about Theodore Voss. Nadia felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. He asked me to call you directly, Dr. Marsh said. He did not want to tell you himself. He thought you had enough to manage today. Tell me what Nadia said. Her voice came out very quiet. A pause. The particular pause of a medical professional choosing their words. Your father's condition has progressed more rapidly than our last assessment indicated, Dr. Marsh said carefully. We have completed new imaging this week. There are some findings we need to discuss with the family. He wanted you to know before you saw him again so that it would not come as a shock. Nadia stared at the road ahead. The trees blurred at the edges of her vision. How long? She asked. Dr. Marsh was quiet for a moment. We would like to speak in person, she said. But I want you to be prepared. We are no longer talking about years. We are likely talking about months, possibly fewer. Priya reached over without looking away from the road and put her hand over Nadia's. She did not say anything. She just held on. Nadia lowered the phone to her lap. Outside the window, the woodland opened onto one of those sweeping views of the valley, the whole county spread out below in the late afternoon gold, the city of Harlow just visible in the distance, small and glittering and entirely indifferent. She thought about 11 years of silence, about the gates of Westfield Manor opening before she could reach the panel because someone had been expecting her, about her father standing at the door with his hands at his sides and that expression she had not been able to read, which she could read now. She understood now. It had been the expression of a man rationing the time he had left and trying to spend it on what mattered most. She thought about how many months she had already lost being angry at him. She thought about how many she might have left. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs, the same gesture she had made on the bench in Harlow that morning, grounding herself against the feeling of everything shifting at once, and she made herself breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The way her mother had taught her as a child when the world felt too large and too loud and too much. Her mother had been gone for 16 years. Now she was going to lose her father too, and this time she would be present for it. This time she would not have the cold comfort of distance and estrangement to insulate her from the grief. This time she would feel every moment of it. She was not sure if that was a gift or a punishment. Perhaps it was both. Priya, she said. Yes, Priya said. I need to go back to Westfield tonight. I need to stay there. Priya squeezed her hand once, then returned it to the wheel. I know, she said. I already turned around. Nadia looked out the window. The valley was still there, still golden, still vast and quiet and entirely real. The city of Harlow glittered in the distance. Somewhere in it Daniel was living his careful constructed life, unaware that the architecture of his deception was being disassembled piece by piece. Somewhere ahead of her, at the end of a long oak-lined driveway, her father was waiting. She had 9 years of marriage to reckon with. She had evidence to build and justice to pursue, and a woman named Tamsin Ord who had finally decided to stop being afraid. She had all of that waiting for her, and it was real and it mattered, and she was going to see it through. But tonight none of that was the most important thing. Tonight the most important thing was a dying man in a stone house who had spent 8 years watching from a distance because he did not know how to find his way back to her. Tonight she was going to show him the way. 3 weeks after the meeting at Westfield Manor, Nadia called Daniel. She had spent those 3 weeks doing 2 things simultaneously, spending every evening with her father at Westfield, sitting with him through the long quiet hours that the illness was increasingly imposing on his days, and spending every morning at Lawrence Obi's offices in central Harlow, working through the evidence with Claire and Patrick and Tamsin, who had handed over her encrypted drive with a steady relief of someone finally setting down something that had been cutting into their hands for years. The evidence was now, in Lawrence's careful professional assessment, overwhelming. Not merely sufficient. Overwhelming. Tamsin's operational records combined with Theodore's forensic financial documentation and Patrick's digital evidence recovery had produced a case so thoroughly constructed that Lawrence had used the word airtight twice in the same sentence and then looked faintly embarrassed by his own enthusiasm. The regulatory authorities had been formally notified. The process was in motion. There was a point, Lawrence explained, at which events would develop their own momentum and Nadia's direct involvement would become secondary to the institutional machinery that had been set in motion. They were approaching that point. But before they reached it, Nadia wanted to look Daniel in the eye. She was not entirely sure why. Priya had questioned it. Gently, carefully, in the way Priya questioned things she considered potentially inadvisable without wanting to override Nadia's judgment. Lawrence had questioned it more directly, citing the legal principle that direct contact between parties in an active dispute created unnecessary complications. Even Theodore, from the armchair in his study where he spent most of his days now, had raised an eyebrow and asked what she hoped to achieve. She had thought about this carefully before answering. She was not going to the meeting to threaten Daniel. She was not going to offer him a choice or deliver an ultimatum or perform the kind of composed, devastating confrontation that existed in satisfying detail in her imagination. She was going because 9 years deserved a conversation. Because she had spent 3 weeks absorbing the full architecture of his betrayal, the accounts, the forgeries, the Alderton Street account name, Sable Renner's compliance architecture, the email to Stuart Greer about her being trusting enough not to look too closely, and she needed to sit across from him with all of that knowledge and simply be seen knowing it. She needed him to understand that she knew. That was all. That was enough. She chose the venue deliberately. Not a restaurant. Too public, too much performance required from both of them. Not a lawyer's office, too formal, too procedural, the wrong kind of battlefield. She called Daniel and told him she wanted to meet at the house. Their house. The house she had chosen and decorated and filled with carefully selected things that were supposed to mean something. He agreed with the easy confidence of someone who had no reason to be suspicious of her motives. He suggested Tuesday at 11. She said fine. She arrived first. She let herself in with a key she had not yet returned, a small deliberate choice, and stood for a moment in the hallway. The house had the particular quality of a space that had recently been altered in ways that were not immediately obvious. Small absences. The coat rack by the door had fewer jackets on it. The shelf in the living room that had held a framed photograph of their first holiday together, the Cornish coast, Nadia sunburned and laughing, Daniel squinting into the light with his arm around her shoulders, was empty, a pale rectangle on the painted wood where the frame had stood. He had already been removing things. Quietly, incrementally, the same way he did everything. She sat at the kitchen table and waited. Daniel arrived at 11 exactly. He walked in without knocking, it was still technically his house too, and stopped when he saw her sitting at the table with her hands folded in front of her and an expression he apparently could not immediately read, because something shifted in his face. Not alarm. Not yet. Just the faint recalibration of a man who had expected one dynamic and found another. You look well, he said. It was the opening move of a man buying time. Thank you, she said. Sit down, Daniel. He sat. He placed his phone face down on the table, a practiced gesture, she now understood, the reflex of a man with things to hide, and he looked at her with a measured attentiveness he deployed when he wanted to appear engaged without committing to anything. What did you want to discuss, he said. I assumed this was about the house valuation. My lawyer has been waiting on your lawyer's response to the revised. I know about the accounts, Nadia said. She said it simply and directly, without build-up or preamble, and she watched the effect of it move across his face the way weather moves across open ground. A barely perceptible stillness, a fractional tightening around the eyes. The rapid, invisible recalculation of someone who has just been told the game they thought they were controlling has changed its rules. What accounts, he said. His voice was steady. She gave him credit for that. The offshore accounts, Daniel. The ones in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg. The ones registered under my name without my authorization. The ones your compliance architect at Freed Capital spent 4 years hiding inside the company's internal systems. She watched him choose his response. She could almost see the selection process, the brief inventory of available positions, the assessment of what she might actually know versus what she might be guessing, the calculation of risk. I do not know what you have been told, he said finally, but whoever your source is, they are not reliable. There are no accounts in your name. If someone has told you that, they are either mistaken or deliberately misleading you. I would strongly suggest. Alderton Meridian Group, Nadia said. The name landed. She saw it land. The stillness in his face deepened into something that was no longer just careful management, but the specific quality of a man who has felt the ground move beneath him and is not yet sure how far it is going to shift. She held his gaze and did not look away. I know why you chose that name, she said quietly. I know what it means. I know what street it references, and I know what I was doing on that street, and I know that you knew. And I want you to understand that I know all of it. Not some of it. Not most of it. All of it. The accounts and the forgeries and Sable Renner and the email to Stuart Greer about me being trusting enough not to look too closely. Daniel said nothing. For perhaps the first time in 9 years of knowing him, he had nothing to say. She stood up. She picked up her bag. She looked at him one final time across the kitchen table in the house she had chosen and decorated and filled with things that were supposed to mean something. I will be in touch through my lawyer, she said. She left the house. She did not look back. She had been back at Westfield Manor for less than 3 hours when Lawrence called. His voice had the particular quality of a man delivering information he would have preferred not to be delivering, measured, careful, but with an undercurrent of something that sharpened her attention before he had finished his first sentence. Daniel has moved, she said, before Lawrence could frame it. This morning, Lawrence said, within 2 hours of your meeting. He has filed an emergency injunction through Stuart Greer's office claiming that you are in possession of fraudulently obtained confidential business documents and that their use in any legal proceeding would constitute a criminal violation. He is also claiming that you and an unnamed third party have engaged in a coordinated campaign of corporate espionage against Freed Capital Group. Nadia sat down in the armchair across from Theodore's. Theodore was watching her from his own chair with a still, careful attention he brought to everything now that his energy had become something to be conserved. He is also, Lawrence continued, and here his voice tightened almost imperceptibly, he is also claiming that the offshore accounts were established with your full knowledge and participation, that you were a willing architect of the financial structure, and that your current legal action is an attempt to reverse course and assign blame to him in anticipation of a regulatory investigation that you yourself initiated. He is saying I designed it, Nadia said. He is saying you designed it, Lawrence confirmed. He has produced what appear to be additional forged documents, more sophisticated than the originals we identified. Signed authorizations in your name, correspondence that appears to show your active direction of the account structure. His legal team has clearly been preparing this contingency for some time. Stuart Greer did not put this together in 2 hours. No, Nadia said. He did not. She looked at Theodore across the room. He met her eyes. He had known this was possible, had told her it was possible, that cornering a man like Daniel always carried the risk of triggering the most dangerous version of him. She had known it too. She had walked into that house on Tuesday morning knowing it, and she had done it anyway. She did not regret it. But she felt the weight of it settle onto her shoulders alongside everything else she was already carrying. Her father's illness, Tamsin's fear, the 3 weeks of evidence building, the 9 years before all of that, and for a moment the accumulated mass of it was very nearly too much. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs. In through the nose, out through the mouth. What does this mean for the timeline? She asked Lawrence. It complicates things, Lawrence said carefully. The injunction will need to be addressed before we can move forward with the regulatory submission. That will take time. His forgeries will need to be countered with our forensic analysis, which we have, but the process of formally presenting and defending it adds weeks, possibly longer. He is trying to slow everything down, to create enough noise and confusion that the picture becomes unclear. Can he succeed? Nadia asked. Lawrence was quiet for a moment. Not ultimately, he said. The weight of evidence on our side is too significant for his counter-narrative to hold under proper scrutiny. But in the short term, yes, he can create problems. He can make this harder and longer and more painful than it needed to be. Of course he can, Nadia said. That is what he does. She ended the call. The study was quiet. The fire burned in the grate. Theodore's clock ticked its unhurried tick. He is going to try to make me the villain, Nadia said. Theodore nodded slowly. He expected you to confront him. Perhaps not quite so directly or so soon, but he had this prepared. He has been preparing it for a long time. I know, Nadia said. Are you all right? Theodore asked. She considered the question with the genuine attention it deserved rather than the reflexive reassurance she might once have offered. She thought about the kitchen table and Daniel's face when she said the name Alderton Meridian Group. She thought about the pale rectangle on the living room shelf where their photograph used to be. She thought about the woman who had sat on a bench in Harlow 3 weeks ago and cried until there was nothing left. She was not that woman anymore. No, she said finally. Not entirely. But I am not going to stop. Theodore looked at his daughter across the quiet study with its books and its fire and its ticking clock. Whatever he saw in her face appeared, as it had in the study 3 weeks ago when she had told him she wanted justice, to satisfy him completely. Good, he said. Then we do not stop. Outside, the oak trees moved in the evening wind. Somewhere in Harlow, Daniel Freed was sitting in Stuart Greer's office congratulating himself on his contingency plan, on his forged documents, on his ability to complicate and confuse and control. He did not know that the woman he had underestimated for 9 years had stopped being afraid of complication. He did not know that she had learned, from a dying man in a stone house on 50 acres of rolling countryside, that the most powerful move in any situation was the one no one saw coming. He did not know what was waiting for him. He would. The injunction took 4 weeks to dismantle. 4 weeks of forensic handwriting analysis formally submitted and defended. 4 weeks of Patrick Reeves sitting in conference rooms across from opposing legal teams, walking through the digital metadata of Daniel's forged documents with the patient, methodical precision of someone who had spent his career making the invisible visible. 4 weeks of Claire Sutton producing financial records so thoroughly cross-referenced and independently verified that Stuart Greer's counter-narrative began to develop visible cracks within the first 10 days and had collapsed almost entirely by the end of the 3rd week. Daniel's additional forgeries, the more sophisticated ones, the ones his legal team had clearly been preparing as a contingency for exactly this scenario, turned out to share a fundamental weakness with the originals. They were convincing to the eye, but not to the instruments. The metadata embedded in the digital versions of the documents told a story that contradicted their apparent dates of creation by anywhere from 14 to 22 months. Patrick had found this within 48 hours of the injunction being filed. Lawrence had presented it to the opposing legal team on day 12. Stuart Greer had requested a recess on day 13 and had not returned to the table with anything resembling confidence since. On the morning of the 28th day, the injunction was formally dismissed. Lawrence called Nadia at Westfield Manor to tell her. She was sitting in the garden with Theodore, who had been having a better week than the previous one. The new medication protocol Dr. Marsh had introduced was managing his pain more effectively, and he had been spending a portion of each afternoon outside, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket in a chair position to catch the late spring sun. He looked fragile in the way that people look fragile when you have recently been reminded of their mortality, but his eyes were sharp and his mind was entirely present, and when Nadia ended the call and told him what Lawrence had said, he nodded once with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a chess game develop exactly as anticipated. "Now," Lawrence said on the phone, his voice carrying the restrained energy of a man who had been waiting for this moment with considerable patience, "we move." The board meeting at Freed Capital Group was scheduled for a Thursday. Daniel did not know its true purpose. He had been told, through the ordinary channels of corporate communication, that it was a routine quarterly review, the kind of meeting he had chaired dozens of times, in which he presented numbers and fielded questions and reinforced his position as the unassailable center of the company he had built. His legal team had taken the dismissal of the injunction as a setback, but not a fatal one. Stuart Greer had told him, according to sources Lawrence declined to identify, that the regulatory investigation was still manageable, that the evidence against him was circumstantial, that with the right legal strategy and the right narrative the whole situation could be navigated. Stuart Greer had not yet understood who owned the board. Nadia arrived at the Freed Capital Group offices on Thursday morning 40 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin. She wore a charcoal gray dress and her mother's pearl earrings, the same earrings she had worn to Gerald Patton's office on that gray Tuesday morning that felt simultaneously like yesterday and like a lifetime ago. She walked through the lobby of the building with the careful, deliberate steadiness of someone whose ribs had healed since then. Not physically, she had no broken ribs, but something else had healed, something less visible and more fundamental, and the steadiness of her walk reflected it. Lawrence met her at the elevator. Claire and Patrick were already upstairs. Tamsin Ord, who had spent the previous 4 weeks providing sworn testimony to the regulatory investigators and preparing to repeat it in any forum required, was waiting in a side room adjacent to the boardroom with the quiet composure of someone who had finally, after 4 years, decided that being afraid of the right thing was better than being afraid of the wrong one. 2 representatives from the Financial Conduct Authority were also present. They had arrived separately, through a side entrance, and were seated at the back of the boardroom when Nadia walked in. She did not go to her usual seat. There was no usual seat. She had never attended a board meeting at Freed Capital. She was not an employee or a director or any kind of official presence in this building. She walked to the head of the table. The chair at the head of the table, Daniel's chair, the one he had occupied for 11 years, the one that had been arranged to face the door so that he could watch people arrive and calibrate his response to each entrance, was empty. She sat down in it. The board members already in the room looked at her with varying degrees of confusion and recognition. Several of them knew her, had met her at company events, at dinners, at the kind of professional social functions where spouses were present but peripheral. None of them had expected to see her here, in this chair, at this table. Lawrence took up a position to her left. He opened his briefcase. He did not speak yet. They waited. Daniel walked in at 9 o'clock exactly. He was dressed, as he had been at Gerald Patton's office 4 weeks ago, with the immaculate precision of a man who understood that appearance was a form of argument. Charcoal suit, dark tie, shoes that caught the light. He walked through the boardroom door with the easy authority of a man arriving at a room that belonged to him and stopped when he saw who was sitting at the head of his table. The stillness that moved across his face was different from the one she had seen in the kitchen at the house. That one had been the stillness of recalculation, of a man quickly assessing and repositioning. This one was different. This one was the stillness of a man who has walked through a door expecting one room and found himself in an entirely different one, who has looked at the board members arranged around the table, at the 2 people at the back of the room he does not recognize, at the woman sitting in his chair, and has understood, in the space of perhaps 3 seconds, that the meeting he thought he was attending is not the meeting that is actually happening. "Nadia," he said. His voice was very controlled. "What is this?" She did not answer immediately. She let the silence hold for a moment, not for drama, not for performance, but because she had earned the right to take up space in it, and she intended to. "Sit down, Daniel," she said. He did not sit. He looked at Lawrence. He looked at the board members. He looked at the two people at the back of the room, and she watched him register. With a jolt she could see move through his body, the regulatory authority identification visible on the lanyard of the woman nearest the wall. "What is going on?" one of the board members asked. Gerald Fenwick, the longest-serving director, a man in his late 60s who had been with the company since its early years and who had, Claire had told Nadia, been deeply uncomfortable with certain financial irregularities he had noticed but had never been able to substantiate. "The agenda has changed," Lawrence said. He produced a document from his briefcase and placed it on the table, a single sheet, clean and precise, which he slid toward Gerald Fenwick. "This meeting will be conducting a formal review of financial misconduct at Freed Capital Group spanning the period of 38 months. The Financial Conduct Authority representatives present are here in an observational capacity in advance of a formal regulatory proceeding that will be initiated following today's meeting." Daniel moved then. He took 2 steps toward the table, his composure beginning to fracture at the edges in the way composure fractures when the thing holding it in place has been removed. "This is completely irregular," he said. "This is not a properly convened board meeting. I have not authorized." "You do not have authority to authorize or prevent this meeting," Lawrence said. "As of 6 weeks ago, Voss Meridian Holdings holds controlling interest in Freed Capital Group and has the legal standing to convene a board review under Section 42 of the company's Articles of Association. The relevant documentation is in the folders in front of each board member." The sound in the room changed. Nadia watched the board members reach for their folders, watched them open them, watched Gerald Fenwick read the first page with the focused attention of a man who had been waiting a long time for something to make sense. "Voss," Daniel said. He looked at Nadia. The last of the composure was gone now, not in an explosive way, but in the way of something that has been under pressure for a very long time and has finally, quietly, given way. "Your father." "My father," Nadia said. "He bought my company." The words came out flat, disbelieving. "He bought your company," Nadia confirmed. 8 months ago. Through a holding structure you had no reason to examine because you had no reason to believe anyone was examining you." She paused. "You were wrong about that. You were wrong about a great many things," Lawrence continued. "The forensic financial analysis before you documents 38 months of systematic embezzlement, totaling an amount he named with the same steady precision Claire had used in the study at Westfield Manor, an amount that landed in the room with the weight of something impossible to minimize or explain away." He continued through the documents. "The shell companies, the offshore accounts, the operational architecture Sable Renner had built inside the company's compliance systems, the forged documentation in Nadia's name, the email to Stuart Greer, the Alderton Meridian account." With each document Lawrence placed on the table, Daniel's options narrowed. Nadia watched it happen. She watched him look at the board members and find no allies, watched Gerald Fenwick's face harden into the expression of a man who had suspected something for years and was now looking at the proof of it. Watched the other directors read their folders with the focused silence of people doing the same arithmetic and arriving at the same answer. Tamsin Ord was brought in at the midpoint of the presentation. She sat at the table and spoke for 20 minutes in a voice that was quiet and precise and entirely steady, and she said everything she had told Nadia in her kitchen and more, the operational details, the internal communications, the specific instructions she had received from Daniel and from Sable Renner, the pressure she had been placed under to maintain her silence. Daniel attempted to interrupt twice. Lawrence stopped him both times with a patience so complete it was itself a kind of devastation. When Tamsin finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Gerald Fenwick spoke. He addressed the board rather than Daniel, which was itself a statement about where authority in the room now resided. "I would like to call a vote," he said, "on the immediate suspension of Mr. Freed's executive duties pending the outcome of the regulatory investigation." All in favor. Every hand around the table went up. Every single one. Daniel stood at the edge of the room and watched the hands rise, and Nadia watched him count them, watched him understand that there was not one person in this room who was going to stand beside him, not one ally remaining, not one relationship that had survived the weight of what he had done. The charm that had carried him through 11 years of building this company, through 9 years of marriage, through 4 years of systematic deception, it had no purchase here. There was nothing left for it to grip. A second vote. Full cooperation with the regulatory investigation. Unanimous. A third. Termination of Daniel Freed's employment for cause, effective immediately. Unanimous. Daniel looked at Nadia one final time across the length of the boardroom table. She met his eyes and held them, and she did not look away, and she did not perform anything for him. No triumph, no satisfaction, no cold smile of victory. She simply looked at him with the clear, steady gaze of a woman who had spent 9 years making herself smaller and had stopped. He looked away first. 2 security officers appeared at the door. Daniel straightened his tie with a gesture that under other circumstances might have been dignified, but here was simply the last available performance of a man who had run out of moves. He walked out of the boardroom between the security officers without speaking. He did not look back. Nadia watched him go. The room around her began the quiet procedural work of aftermath. Lawrence speaking with the regulatory representatives, Gerald Fenwick moving toward Nadia with an expression that mixed professional gravity with something that looked like long overdue relief, Tamsin sitting very still at the table with her hands folded and her eyes closed, breathing. Priya appeared in the doorway. She had been waiting in the corridor, had refused to wait anywhere further away than that, and she looked at Nadia with a question in her face that needed no words. Nadia looked back at her best friend across the room. She nodded once. It was done. The sentencing took place on a Wednesday morning in early autumn. Nadia did not attend. She had considered it, had sat with the question for several days, turning it over with the same careful attention she now brought to decisions that mattered, checking her own motivations the way you check a wound to see whether it is healing or simply closing over something that still needs attention. She had concluded, honestly and without drama, that there was nothing the courtroom could give her that she had not already given herself. The justice she had needed was not the kind dispensed by a judge in a formal proceeding. It had happened in a boardroom on a Thursday morning when every hand in the room went up and Daniel Freed walked out between 2 security officers with nowhere left to go. She had been there for that. That was enough. Lawrence called her at noon with the outcome. Daniel had entered a guilty plea to 3 counts of fraud and 1 count of forgery, a negotiated arrangement that his lawyers had pursued with the particular urgency of people who had seen the evidence against their client and understood that a trial would be both longer and considerably more damaging. The sentence was 4 years, of which he would serve a minimum of 2. A financial penalty that Lawrence described, with the restrained satisfaction of someone who had spent months building toward this moment, as substantial. A permanent prohibition from serving as a director or officer of any company registered in the United Kingdom. His career in finance was over. Sable Renner had been charged separately and had also entered a guilty plea. Stuart Greer was under investigation by his own professional regulatory body. The Alderton Meridian accounts had been frozen, the funds within them identified and traced, the process of recovery underway. Nadia listened to all of this from the garden at Westfield Manor, sitting in the chair beside her father's while he dozed in the afternoon sun. Biscuit, the rescue dog she had collected from the shelter 3 weeks earlier, a large, ungainly, profoundly affectionate animal of indeterminate breed who had immediately annexed Theodore's garden as his personal domain, stretched across both their feet with a complete conviction of a creature that had always lived here and always would. She thanked Lawrence. She ended the call. She sat for a moment in the quiet autumn garden and let the information settle through her the way rain settles into ground, not dramatically, not with any particular sensation of release or catharsis, but simply and completely, finding the places that needed it and filling them. Theodore stirred in his chair. He looked at her with the half-focused clarity of someone surfacing from a light sleep. "Lawrence," she said. He nodded. "And, for years," she said. "He pleaded guilty." Theodore was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good." Not triumphantly. Just the single word, carrying the weight of everything it meant. All the months of preparation, all the years before that of watching from a distance, all the careful patient work of a man who had decided that the only form of love available to him was protective rather than present, and who had poured everything he had into making it count. Good, he said again. Then he closed his eyes and turned his face back toward the sun. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later. The settlement, negotiated in the absence of Daniel's stolen assets and with the full weight of the forensic financial documentation applied to the question of what the legitimate marital estate actually consisted of, was considerably more substantial than the arrangement Daniel had proposed on that gray Tuesday morning in Gerald Patton's office. The house was hers. A financial settlement that reflected 9 years of contribution to a marriage and a life that had been systematically exploited. Enough to begin again on her own terms, in her own time, in whatever direction she decided to go. She did not feel victorious when Lawrence sent through the final signed documents. She felt, quietly and unexpectedly, the same thing she had felt in Gerald Patton's office when the pen moved across the page, that specific, complicated relief of a door finally, completely closed. She felt free. Theodore Voss died on a Sunday morning in late November, in his own bed, in the room that looked out over the gardens and the valley beyond. Nadia was holding his hand. She had moved into Westfield Manor 6 weeks earlier when Dr. Marsh had advised that he had entered the final stage and that his remaining time was now a matter of weeks. She had not hesitated. She had packed a bag and driven out through the narrowing roads and the stretches of woodland and down the oak-lined driveway, and she had moved into the guest room that had become, over the preceding months, simply her room, and she had been there every morning and every evening and most of the hours in between. They had talked. Properly, thoroughly, in the way that people talk when time has become finite and the ordinary reasons for avoiding difficult things have dissolved. They had talked about her mother, about the woman she had been before the illness, fierce and funny and more complicated than Nadia's grief-shaped memory had fully preserved. They had talked about Theodore's past, the things he had done that he was not proud of, the long, slow work of becoming someone different, the particular loneliness of having more money than anyone knew and less peace than anyone would have believed. They had talked about Nadia's marriage. Not as a wound to be examined, but as a chapter that had ended and could now be understood with a clarity that distance brought. She had loved Daniel, she told her father one evening. Not the Daniel who had existed in reality, the one she had spent the past year learning about, but the Daniel she had believed in, the one constructed from 9 years of selective attention and stubborn hope. She had loved that version with everything she had. The grief of discovering he had never existed was real, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But she was also not going to let it be the defining story of her life. Theodore had listened to this without offering solutions or reframings or the kind of well-intentioned commentary that diminishes grief by trying to resolve it too quickly. He had simply listened, which was, she had come to understand, the most valuable thing he knew how to give her. 2 days before the end, he had taken her hand with a grip that was weaker than it had been even a week before, and he had looked at her with eyes that were tired and at peace in equal measure, and he had said something she had been turning over ever since. "I spent 30 years being afraid of the wrong things," he said. "Afraid of losing the money. Afraid of losing the power. Afraid of what people would think if they knew where it all came from. All that fear and not one moment of it protected me from the thing I actually lost." He had paused. "Do not be afraid of the wrong things, Nadia. That is all I ask. Know what actually matters and be afraid of losing that. Everything else will take care of itself." She had promised him. She had meant it. On the Sunday morning when he died, the light was coming through the bedroom windows in long pale shafts, the kind of autumn light that has a particular quality of stillness and permission, and the gardens outside were quiet and golden, and Biscuit was asleep at the foot of the bed because no one had seen any reason to prevent this, and Theodore Voss died as peacefully as a man who had made his peace could die, with his daughter's hand in his and the morning light on his face. Nadia sat with him for a long time after. Not crying, not yet. The tears would come later in waves, over weeks and months, arriving unexpectedly the way grief always does. Just sitting. Just being present in the room with the man she had spent 11 years hating and 8 months learning and far too little time actually knowing. She was grateful for the 8 months. She was grateful for every hour of them. 1 year later, Nadia sat in the garden at the cottage she had bought on the western edge of Harlow, a small stone house with large windows and a garden that required more work than she had anticipated and that she loved with an intensity disproportionate to its size. Biscuit dozed in a patch of late afternoon sun. A cup of tea cooled on the table beside her. She had sold Westfield Manor in the spring, as Theodore had asked her to. He had not wanted her to feel anchored to it, had wanted her to choose her own space rather than inhabit his. She had donated the majority of his fortune to 3 charitable foundations she had spent several months selecting with the same careful attention she brought to everything now. She had retained enough to buy the cottage, to fund the new direction her professional life was taking, and to ensure that the work Theodore had cared most about continued. She had not returned to her old job. The promotion they had offered still stood, and she had thanked them and declined it, and the decision had not felt like loss but like clarity. She had spent the year building something different, a consultancy focused on corporate ethics and financial transparency, working with companies to build the kind of internal accountability structures that might prevent another Freed Capital, another Sable Renner, another 4 years of a woman like Tamsin Ord carrying an impossible weight alone because she had no safe way to set it down. It was smaller than the work Theodore had done. It was quieter. It was entirely hers. Tamsin worked with her. She had approached Nadia 3 months after the boardroom and asked, with the directness of someone who had learned the hard way that indirect approaches cost more than they saved, whether there was a place for her in whatever Nadia was building. There was. Tamsin's 4 years of understanding how financial misconduct embedded itself inside institutional systems had turned out to be, reframed and redirected, extraordinarily valuable. They worked well together in the way that people who have been through something difficult in proximity sometimes do, with a mutual respect built on the particular foundation of shared survival. Priya was getting married in the spring. Nadia was the maid of honor. They had spent the past month in disagreement about centerpieces, which Priya considered an important decision and Nadia considered an opportunity for comedy. The disagreement was ongoing and neither of them wanted it to end. Gerald Fenwick had reached out 2 months after the board meeting with an offer of a non-executive directorship at a company he was rebuilding from a similarly compromised foundation. Nadia had accepted. She served on the board with the specific intention of being the person who asked the uncomfortable questions, the person who noticed the things that careful, motivated people constructed to be unnoticeable. She was, it turned out, good at this. She had spent 9 years in close proximity to a man who constructed things to be unnoticeable, and she had learned his methods more thoroughly than either of them had realized. She thought about Daniel sometimes, not with anger, that had burned itself out sometime in the long quiet months of her father's final weeks, consumed by griefs that were larger and more real than anything Daniel had left her with. Not with sadness either. Just occasionally, in the way you think about a version of your life that ended, with a mild and slightly distant curiosity of someone reviewing a chapter of a book they have definitively finished. He was in a minimum security facility in the north of England. She had not sought this information, but it had found its way to her through Lawrence, who mentioned it with a careful neutrality of someone not entirely sure whether she wanted to know. She had received it with the same neutrality and filed it away in the category of things that were real but no longer relevant to her life. She did not wish him harm. She did not wish him anything at all. He was simply someone she used to know. A chapter closed. A door locked from her side. The afternoon light moved across the garden in the way that late autumn light moves, slanted and golden and slightly elegiac, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look significant because they are. Biscuit stretched in his patch of sun, sighed with the profound satisfaction of a creature whose needs were completely met, and settled back into his nap. Somewhere down the lane, a neighbor's children were playing. The sound of it drifted over the garden wall, bright and shapeless and alive. Nadia picked up her tea. She thought about her father's words, the ones she had been turning over for a year. Know what actually matters and be afraid of losing that. Everything else will take care of itself. She looked at the garden, at the cottage windows with their warm light beginning to show as the afternoon deepened, at Biscuit's enormous paws twitching in whatever dream currently held him. She thought about her mother's letters, which she kept in a box on the shelf in the study, the letters Theodore had held for 15 years, waiting for the right time. She had read them so many times now that she could hear her mother's voice in them without effort, could call it up whenever she needed it. Her mother had been brave and complicated and imperfect and entirely real, and the knowledge of her felt like something Nadia carried inside her own chest, not a wound anymore, not an absence, but a presence, warm and steady and permanent. She thought about what it had cost her to get here. The 9 years. The gray Tuesday morning. The bench in Harlow. The oak-lined driveway and the iron gates opening before she could reach the panel, and her father standing at the door with his hands at his sides. She thought about all the moments she had pressed her hands flat against her thighs and made herself breathe. All the moments she had stood up and straightened her blazer and put one foot in front of the other without knowing where it was leading. It had led here. To this garden. To this light. To this life, quiet and imperfect and genuinely, entirely hers. She had not needed saving. She had needed the door to open and the courage to walk through it. She had needed the truth and the time and the people who refused to stop standing behind her even when she did not know they were there. She had needed, in the end, to choose herself. Once, clearly, without looking back. Everything else had followed from that. The sun touched the top of the garden wall and began its descent. Biscuit woke from his dream and looked at her with the uncomplicated devotion of a creature for whom the present moment was the only moment that existed. She reached down and scratched behind his ears, and he leaned into her hand with his whole body. I did it, she thought. Not to anyone in particular. To the light, perhaps. To the garden. To her mother's voice inside her chest. I found my way back. The autumn evening settled around her, quiet and golden and entirely her own, and Nadia Calloway sat in her garden, whole, healed, free, and let herself be exactly where she was. If this story reached something inside you, if any part of Nadia's journey felt familiar, you are not alone. This channel exists for the moments when you need to be reminded that your story is not over. Leave a comment below. Share what moved you. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week we bring you stories of resilience, truth, and transformation. Like this video if you believe that every person deserves to know their own worth. And share it with someone who needs to hear this message today. This story is an original work created for this channel. Every character, every detail, and every word has been crafted to inspire and remind you that no matter how dark the chapter you are living through, the ending has not been written yet. Thank you for being part of this community. Priya Anand arrived at Nadia's front door at 7:30 the following morning carrying 2 takeaway coffees and the particular expression of someone who had been awake for most of the night on someone else's behalf. Nadia had called her at 11 the previous evening. Not with a plan, not with a coherent account of everything that had happened, just with a specific, wordless distress signal that existed between people who had known each other long enough to have developed their own private language of need. She had said Priya's name and stopped, and Priya had said, I will be there in the morning, and had not asked any of the questions that could wait until morning. That was the thing about Priya. She had an instinctive understanding of which questions could wait. Nadia opened the door and Priya looked at her. Really looked, the way she always did, with the focused attention of someone who had learned over 20 years of friendship that the most important information was usually the stuff Nadia was not saying, and she handed over the coffee and walked inside without waiting to be invited because she had not needed to be invited to this house since the year they both turned 24. You look terrible, Priya said, in the tone of voice that made this a statement of care rather than criticism. Thank you, Nadia said. They sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Nadia had been sitting when she found the unlocked phone 14 months ago, a detail she was aware of with the low persistent awareness of someone who had never quite been able to make a room feel neutral again after something happened in it. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and she told Priya everything. Gerald Patton's office, the mahogany table, the 3 documents and the 12 minutes and the silver pen, Daniel's new suit and his polished shoes and the way he had glanced at her like furniture being assessed. The pale rectangle on the shelf where their photograph used to be. The bench in Harlow. The 4 missed calls from the unrecognized number. Priya listened without interrupting. This was one of her extraordinary qualities, the ability to absorb difficult information without reflexively filling every pause with response, to let things land completely before she spoke. When Nadia finished, Priya was quiet for a moment, her own coffee untouched, her eyes steady and serious across the table. Then she said, "I need to tell you something. And I need you to hear it as someone who loves you and not as someone delivering a verdict." Nadia looked at her. "Tell me." "I have been worried about you for 2 years," Priya said. "Not in a general way. In a specific way. The way you started apologizing for things that were not your fault. The way you stopped talking about your own work, your own ideas, like they had become somehow less important than whatever Daniel needed that week. The way you flinched sometimes in conversations when his name came up, even in perfectly ordinary contexts, like you were permanently braced for something." She paused. "I noticed all of it. And I said nothing because every time I came close to saying something you redirected the conversation, and I told myself you were handling it in your own way and that it was not my place to push." She met Nadia's eyes directly. "I should have pushed," she said. "I am sorry I did not push." Nadia felt the truth of this settle through her, without the sting she might once have felt at it. There was no accusation in Priya's words, only the honest accounting of a friend who had made a choice she now wished she had made differently, delivered without self-protection or deflection. "You tried once," Nadia said. "About 18 months ago. At Rosaria's birthday dinner." Priya nodded. "You told me I was reading too much into things and changed the subject to the food." "The food was genuinely very good," Nadia said. Something shifted between them. The particular shift that sometimes happens when people are talking about something painful and find unexpectedly that it contains a small pocket of lightness, not enough to diminish the weight of it but enough to make it briefly bearable. Priya smiled. Then her expression settled back into seriousness. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Nadia told her about the missed calls. About the country code she had not immediately recognized. About the 4 attempts across a single afternoon from a number that had no name attached to it, and that she had been too exhausted and too submerged in the aftermath of Gerald Patton's office to return. Priya picked up her coffee. "Have you called it back?" she asked. "Not yet." "Why not?" Nadia considered the question. "Because I have had enough information for one day," she said finally. "Because yesterday I found out my marriage is officially over and my husband does not consider me worth looking at across a table, and whatever that phone call contains I am not sure I have the capacity to absorb it on top of everything else." Priya looked at her steadily. "What if it is important?" "Everything is important," Nadia said. "That is the problem. Everything is too important and there is too much of it, and I am sitting in this kitchen and I cannot quite remember what my life looked like before it all started coming apart." Priya reached across the table and put her hand over Nadia's. Her grip was warm and firm and entirely uncomplicated, the grip of someone who was not going anywhere and needed Nadia to know that. "Here is what we are going to do," Priya said. "You are going to call the number. I am going to sit right here while you do it. And whatever it is, whatever it means, we are going to figure out the next step together. Not all the steps. Just the next one." Nadia looked at her best friend across the kitchen table. At the woman who had shown up at 7:30 in the morning with 2 coffees and 20 years of accumulated loyalty. At the woman who had watched and worried and waited and was now sitting in the direct light of everything she had been worried about, steady and present and completely unafraid. "Just the next one," she repeated. Priya nodded. "That is all you ever need." Nadia picked up her phone. She found the number, still there, still unnamed, the 4 missed calls listed in a neat column beneath the single word unknown. She pressed call before she could think about it long enough to find a reason not to. It rang twice. A man answered. His voice was measured and professional, carrying the particular cadence of someone accustomed to delivering significant information in a way designed to prevent the recipient from panicking before they had heard all of it. "Mrs. Freed," he said. "Thank you for returning my call. My name is Lawrence Obie. I am a solicitor. I represent a client who has asked me to make contact with you as a matter of some urgency. I want to assure you before I say anything further that this call is entirely in your interest and that what I have to tell you is—" He paused, selecting his word with evident care, "consequential." Nadia looked at Priya across the table. Priya watched her with the focused, alert attention of someone reading a situation from one side of a conversation. "Who is your client?" Nadia asked. Lawrence Obie was quiet for a moment. "His name is Theodore Voss," he said. "I believe you know him as your father." The kitchen was very still. The coffee had gone cold. Outside the window, the morning was getting on with itself with complete indifference, the way mornings did. "I have not spoken to my father in 11 years, Nadia said carefully. "I do not have a relationship with my father. I do not know why he would be contacting me through a solicitor, and I am not sure I want to know." "I understand," Lawrence said. "And I want to be clear that my client is not asking for a relationship, or for forgiveness, or for anything beyond the opportunity to share some information with you that he believes you urgently need. Information relating to your husband, and to certain financial arrangements that have been made on your behalf without your knowledge." The last 3 words landed with a precision that cut through the numbness she had been wrapped in since the previous morning. "Without my knowledge," she repeated. "Without your knowledge," Lawrence confirmed. "Mrs. Freed, I would very much like to meet with you in person. At your convenience, at a location entirely of your choosing. What I have to tell you is not something I am able to do adequate justice to over the phone." Nadia looked at Priya. Priya was watching her with an expression that had shifted from alert to something more electric, the expression of someone who has just registered that the conversation they are witnessing has moved into entirely unexpected territory. "Give me a moment," Nadia said to Lawrence. She lowered the phone. She looked at Priya. "He says he is a solicitor," Nadia said. "Representing my father. He says my father has information about Daniel. About financial arrangements made in my name without my knowledge." Priya stared at her. "Your father," she said. "The father you have not spoken to in 11 years. That one, yes." Priya looked at the phone in Nadia's hand. She looked at Nadia's face. Then she said the thing that Nadia most needed someone to say. Not advice, not caution, not a measured assessment of risks and considerations, but simply and directly the thing that was true. "You have to meet him," she said. Nadia looked at her best friend for a long moment. Then she raised the phone back to her ear. "Mr. Obie," she said. "When can we meet?" They met Lawrence Obie that afternoon at a quiet hotel on the north side of Harlow, Nadia's choice of venue, as he had offered. Priya came with her. Nadia had not asked her to, and Priya had not offered. She had simply picked up her coat when Nadia picked up hers, and that had been that. Lawrence Obie was a man in his late 50s with a composed, unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades in rooms where significant things were decided and had developed an immunity to being rushed. He stood when they entered, shook both their hands, waited until they were seated before he sat down himself, and opened the meeting not with documents or disclosures but with a question. He asked Nadia what she knew about her father's professional life. Not very much, she told him honestly. She knew he had money. Her mother had told her that much, in the understated way her mother had of acknowledging things she found uncomfortable. She knew he had business interests she had never fully understood. She knew he had been absent for most of her childhood and present in ways that felt more obligatory than genuine for the years before the estrangement. She knew that when she cut him out of her life 11 years ago, she had done so with the conviction of someone who had enough evidence to make a permanent decision and had never looked back. Lawrence listened to all of this with the same careful attention he had given her silence on the phone. Then he opened the folder on the table between them. What I am about to tell you, he said, will require some time to absorb. I ask only that you hear all of it before you respond to any of it. Can you do that? Nadia looked at the folder, at the documents visible beneath the cover page, at the name at the top of the first sheet, Voss Meridian Holdings, which meant nothing to her yet. She looked at Priya, who gave her the smallest nod. She looked back at Lawrence. Yes, she said. Tell me everything. Coming up next, you'll see 2 more stories we handpicked just for you. If this one struck a chord, you're going to love what's next. Tap to keep the journey going.